What if St. Petersburg was not built from scratch, but merely declared a new city on the site of something that had already existed before? This idea sounds bold, but too many details in the familiar version do not add up. For many years we have been told a simple story. Peter the Great came to a deserted shore, pointed to a place, and on the swamps, almost out of nothing, a new capital arose. It is a beautiful story, a convenient one. But as soon as you begin to look at maps, chronicles, and the geography of the region, the picture immediately becomes more complicated. Around the future St. Petersburg there were already fortresses: Koporye, Ivangorod, Narva, Yam, Staraya Ladoga. These are not random points. They line up along an ancient natural boundary that geologists associate with the Baltic Ladoga Clint. Once, this was the shore of a vast body of water. And here an uncomfortable question arises. If these fortresses supposedly defended the coastline, why do many of them today stand far from the water, sometimes at a noticeable distance from the present shoreline? Suspenseful. There are only two explanations. Either their purpose was entirely different, or the water itself used to be somewhere other than where we are accustomed to seeing it now. And this is no fantasy. The relief of northwestern Russia preserves traces of old shores, escarpments, elevations, the lines along which fortifications were placed. All this suggests that the hydrography of the region changed greatly. Where there is land today, there may once have been water boundaries, and where there are now narrow rivers, there were once broad and important routes of communication. Ancient chronicles speak directly of major navigable arteries. They mention the Luga, the Narva, the Volkhov, and other rivers of the region. Merchant ships traveled along them, military forces moved along them. But today, some of these rivers look far too modest for such descriptions. In some places, what was once not a mighty artery is now almost a stream. And then the question becomes even sharper. Would anyone really have built massive stone fortresses designed for major war for the sake of a few small vessels? Logic suggests otherwise. Such fortifications are placed where there is control over a passage, over water, over trade movement, not in some random inland depth but on a key defensive line. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine exactly those historical knots that are usually passed over. Then the mysteries of St. Petersburg itself begin. Why was such a heavy, marshy terrain chosen for the new capital if more understandable and convenient locations existed nearby? How, under conditions of war, lack of resources, and weak infrastructure, was it possible to launch such a gigantic construction project so quickly? Where did they bring stone, timber, metal, and food from? Who supplied the thousands of workers? And how did all this function in a damp, cold, and dangerous land where even proper roads had yet to be created? Whispering, the most curious part begins when you open the early plans of the city. On some old schemes and images, St. Petersburg looks far too developed for the first years of its existence. You can see blocks, building lines, elements of infrastructure that under ordinary logic would require decades. A strange feeling arises, as if part of the city did not emerge gradually, but had already been prepared, discovered, or quickly adapted for the new capital. Excited, and this already changes the very framing of the question. What if Peter the Great was not so much a creator as an appropriator and restorer of an already existing space? Of course, this is not a proven conclusion, but it is a strong research hypothesis. It tries to explain several oddities at once. Why there are so many ancient fortresses nearby, why their positions align better with an old shoreline than with the present one, why the chronicles describe a different water system, and why early St. Petersburg in some sources looks as though much more time had passed for its development. The official version does not answer everything. It speaks of strategic necessity, of the monarch's will, of a breakthrough to the sea. All of that is important, but details remain that fit poorly into the ceremonial picture. The geology of the region, traces of an ancient shore, the unusual placement of fortresses, and the overly rapid transformation of swamps into the capital of an empire. Therefore, the main question sounds like this. Did Peter found St. Petersburg in the full sense of the word, or did he rediscover, rebuild, and rename a place whose history had begun long before him? It is with this question that the real investigation begins. Not about a beautiful legend, but about who this space really belonged to before, and why the memory of it might have turned out to be so inconvenient. The Luga and Volkhov rivers are important here, not in and of themselves. More important is their direction. They do not run parallel to the shores, but seem to draw the water away from the glint toward the gulf. This looks less like an accident than like the trace of an old water system in which rivers, bays, and passages work together. If we allow for the possibility that the sea once came closer to the fortresses, much begins to fall into place. Then Koporye, Yam, Ivangorod, and Staraya Ladoga were not deep inland but by the water, not merely nearby, but in a zone of direct access for ships, cargo, and military detachments. For medieval fortification, this was fundamental. A fortress without convenient access to water lost part of its purpose. It was supplied worse. It received help more slowly, and it controlled trade routes more weakly. Old Swedish and Russian maps from the 17th and 18th centuries add important details to this picture. On them, the Gulf of Finland often looks wider than it does now, and around it one can see a dense network of waterways. They link the shores, the gulf, and the lakes into a single knot. Such maps were not made by armchair fantasists. They were drawn by people who traveled the terrain, measured slopes, marked fords, canals, obstacles, and elevations. Errors are possible there, but to invent such a system wholesale is almost impossible. And here the most uncomfortable question arises. If modern cities stand far from the water, then how did their ports function back then? It is hard to explain everything by navigable rivers alone. Dozens of kilometers upstream, without canals and locks, would have turned any transport into a costly and slow operation. For the ordinary life of fortresses, that would have been too burdensome. So either there was more water, or there existed a different logistics system that we now see only in fragments. By the way, if such mismatches between history and geography interest you, subscribe to the channel. This is exactly where we examine places where the map argues with the textbook. Against this background, the Baltic Ladoga glint becomes especially important. It is a long geological escarpment. It stretches for almost 1,200 kilometers, from Estonia to Lake Ladoga. At first glance, it is just a rocky ridge with forests and cliffs. But in the history of northwestern Russia, it played a far greater role. The glint was at once a landmark, a natural wall, and a construction base. It is precisely along this line that many ancient fortresses stand: Koporye, Ivangorod, Narva, Staraya Ladoga. Such a coincidence is hard to call accidental. Height gave a view, the escarpment gave protection, and proximity to ancient waterways gave control over the movement of people, goods, and troops. This is no longer a set of separate points. It is an entire system of strongholds. There is also one more detail that is rarely spoken aloud. Today, many of these fortresses stand noticeably above sea level, but old maps and the relief hint that water once came much closer to them. If that is so, the glint was not merely an elevation. It was an ancient shoreline, or its most important landmark. Then the fortresses were built with changing water levels in mind. On one side, convenient access for ships, on the other, natural protection, and at the same time, a reserve of height in case the water rose. For its time, this was a very intelligent strategy. An astonishing picture emerges. What we now consider a marshy periphery may once have been part of a powerful coastal system. Archaeology is not silent either. In the Ladoga area, hoards of Arab silver coins have been found. This is a direct sign of broad trade. Here there was an exchange not only of goods but of technologies, customs, and influences, which means that the northwest of Rus was not a dead end, but a crossroads, and the glint served as its rigid framework. Even the local stone worked within this logic. Limestone was quarried directly from the exposed faces of the glint. It was used for walls, foundations, and fortifications. In other words, the natural boundary not only indicated where to build, it also provided the material for the construction itself. Geology here was literally turning into politics and warfare. That is why today's swamps, forests, and remoteness from the water may not be the original picture, but the later result of major changes. Climate, sedimentation, changes in riverbeds, human activity. All of this could, step by step, have erased the former shoreline. The water receded. The channels disappeared. But legends and old maps preserved the memory of a different landscape, and the more closely you look at the glint, the fortresses, and the riverbeds, the clearer one's simple thought becomes. The history of this region was far more maritime than it seems today. In Estonia, this escarpment reaches directly to the Baltic Sea. Even today, the waves cut into the shore. They expose fresh layers of rock, and each such cut seems to reveal the true age of these places. It was on such frontiers that the first trade and cultural hubs of the Slavic North were born. Towers rose on the glint heights, fortress walls grew nearby, settlements stretched toward the water, and this was no accident. Scientists still argue about how exactly the glint itself was formed. There is no single answer. But there is less and less doubt about one thing. Its role in the fate of Russia's northwestern lands was colossal. It was not just a beautiful escarpment and not merely a convenient height for keeping watch. It was the natural framework of the region. Trade routes rested on it, defensive lines were built on it. For centuries, power over the water, the land, and the passages between them was secured on it. From the 9th century onward, northern rulers chose these places not only for protection. They placed fortresses directly on the ancient maritime boundary, on a line that had sunk too deeply into local legend. Hence the tales of vanished seas, hence the stories of ancient catastrophes. Serious, if you gather all these details together, the glint ceases to be just a geological term. It becomes the key to understanding why it was precisely here that the struggle for land, resources, and access to trade arteries went on for centuries. It was here that strange cities arose. It was here that entire political entities disappeared. And so the glint itself can be seen as a symbol. Not an abstract one, but a thoroughly historical one. Deciphering it can tell us a great deal about the region's real past, and perhaps the most important answers still lie ahead. Then another question arises, this time about Petersburg. When we hear about the construction of a huge city, the imagination paints a clear plan, precise calculations, and flawless logistics. But Petersburg, at the beginning of the 18th century, looked entirely different, more like a tense camp on the edge of war. Decisions there were often made quickly, sometimes almost recklessly. The official version is simple. Peter the Great chose the swampy delta for a strategic breakthrough and access to the Baltic. But as soon as you start looking at the details, this scheme no longer seems so straightforward. In the northwest, strongholds already existed: Ivangorod, Narva, Koporye. These were not empty places, but fortresses with a heavy history, stone walls, and clear military logic. And yet the new capital did not appear there. It grew up in a damp and dangerous area, and at such speed that many researchers are left with an uncomfortable question. Did the builders perhaps make use of something already prepared? Suspenseful, think about it yourself. The city was being created literally on the front line of the Great Northern War. The threat of a Swedish strike had not gone anywhere. The country's resources were limited. There was no heavy machinery. There were no modern communications. The delivery of stone, lime, timber, food, and clothing was organized by hand. And yet within just a few years, streets, squares, embankments, canals, and complex engineering lines appeared. By the way, if you are interested in historical inconsistencies like these, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine exactly the details that usually remain outside the schoolbook version. The archives report the mass mobilization of peasants, craftsmen, and forced laborers from across the country. They had to fell forests, drain the marshes, fill in unstable ground, build housing, warehouses, piers, and stone buildings. For the people of that time, it was almost a passage into another world. The roads were difficult, the terrain was wet, supplies broke down constantly, but within just a quarter of a century, the maps show not the beginnings of a settlement, but a developed urban organism. And this is where the sharpest doubts begin. If everything really was built from scratch, then how was it possible to create so quickly a system that in other countries took decades, and sometimes centuries? Where did they bring such enormous volumes of stone and sand from? How did they coordinate tens of thousands of people without modern means of management? Why are traces of earlier soil development found in the cultural layers? And why does the geometry of some quarters coincide with ancient roots known from chronicle references? Whispering particularly curious are old maps, engravings, and commemorative medals. They sometimes say more than official texts. On them, fortresses that today stand far from the water are depicted as almost port-like. Ships can be seen by the walls. Life is bustling at the piers. Merchant vessels sail on the horizon. This concerns Narva, Yam, Koporye, and a number of Staraya Ladoga fortifications. Such a picture is hard to dismiss as mere artistic fantasy. Old cartographers often worked from real trade routes, coastal outlines, and merchants' reports. Maritime symbols also appear on commemorative medals near fortress walls. The wave comes almost right up to them. Harbors are visible, ships are visible. All this indirectly points to a different appearance of the region in the past. Excited, which means that many of today's distances to the sea may once have been completely different. The same applies to the early plans of Petersburg. In some images from the first decades, it looks not like a chaotic construction site, but like an almost finished metropolis, with quarters, canals, warehouse zones, bridges, clear logistics. Moreover, in a number of lithographs, buildings and elements of infrastructure are noticeable that, according to the official chronology, should have appeared much later. Hence the version that some of the structures may not have been built from scratch, but found, rebuilt, and incorporated into the new capital system. Modern historians usually respond cautiously. They speak of ground subsidence, changes in the shoreline, fluctuations in water level, and later alterations. All of this is indeed possible. But when there are too many coincidences, the questions do not disappear. Why do the old waterways on maps look wider and more important than the present ones? Where did certain straits and harbors go? Why does part of the architecture seem designed for a completely different flow of people, goods, and ships? Serious. And here we return again to the glint, because this whole line astonishingly connects geology and history. On its slopes, archaeologists find traces of a very long economic life. Burned bones, metal objects, parts of fishing gear, traces of workshops, stone foundations of buildings. All this speaks of centuries of activity long before the familiar forms of statehood. Nature itself preserves memory well here. Sedimentary layers cover old horizons, but from time to time they open up, and then new finds appear. It is already known that along the line of the glint there were not only fortresses, but entire settlement complexes, often near aquifers. This was vitally important. Water provided stability, which means such places were suitable for permanent life, for crafts and for trade. In the cultural layers, tools for working stone are found. Objects of bone carving and leatherworking are found. Glass beads turn up, similar to Scandinavian and Baltic examples. This is an important detail. It points to interregional connections, which means the local centers were not isolated. They were part of a broad exchange network, and a very long time ago. Nearby, the remains of ritual sites are found. There are traces of fortifications. There are fragments of ancient boats and ship fittings. All this intensifies the debate about migration routes and old trade roads. And it also shows that the glint served not only as a defensive line, it was an administrative boundary, an economic axis, and a place where power was concentrated. What is especially interesting is that along different sections of this line, from the Swedish shores to the area of Lake Ladoga, signs of developed life appear almost simultaneously in different eras. This is no longer a random chain of scattered campsites. It is a system, and a large one, suspenseful, and in the oldest rocks at the base of the glint. Rare minerals were found that are usually associated with special deep earth conditions, and this detail only adds more mysteries. The more closely you look at the northwest, the clearer a simple thought becomes. This is not the edge of history before us. This is one of its main hubs. Here nature shaped the future roads. Here water and stone determined the fate of fortresses. Here the old shores may have been nothing like the way we see them now, and that is exactly why debates about St. Petersburg, ancient ports, vanished straits, and forgotten settlements still do not die down. These minerals made the shore convenient for life. It was easier here to find drinking water, but their role was not limited to that. Amulets were made from local stone and mineral inclusions. They were placed in burials. That means the glint was not only a support for everyday life, but also part of the sacred world of ancient people. If you look at this escarpment from the water, the picture becomes especially clear. Before us is not just a shore. It is a chain of strong points. Fortresses, towers, and settlements stood at a distance from one another, but functioned as a single system. They controlled the passage between land and water. Goods were transported here. Warbands passed through here. Craft goods, metal, and knowledge were exchanged here. Serious after the melting of the ancient glacier, it was the glint that became the boundary where the landscape changed often. In some eras, water roared here. In others, forest grew where former shores had been. Old harbors lost their importance, but new areas for development appeared. This is how a special economic model took shape. It relied on both transport and natural resources. Clay, limestone, water, and convenient routes all played their part. Archaeology confirms this. Along the Baltic Ladoga glint, burial mounds, Traces of settlements and graves connected with the era of active water routes have been found. These routes linked Novgorod, Scandinavia, and the Baltic coast. Imported items are found at campsites and in cultural layers. These are Byzantine coins, trade seals, brass rings, and glass beads made in Western Europe. All of this points to one thing. The region was not a remote backwater. It lived at the junction of several worlds. By the way, if you're interested in details like these, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine the history of places not through myths, but through the traces left in the ground. Trade and military routes ran between the fortresses on the glint. Merchants and detachments moved along the escarpments, and the ancient names of villages and hill forts still preserve traces of Germanic and Finnic roots. This is an important detail. Toponymy often outlives entire eras and preserves memory, even where the structures themselves have disappeared. Whispering no less curious are the local legends. Stories about ghosts near the cliffs, strange creatures and accursed places did not appear out of nowhere. For centuries, people feared the areas at the foot of the rocks where the water churns even in calm weather. The memory of floods, collapses, and sudden natural blows easily turned into tales of sunken towns and vanished settlements. Sometimes unusual minerals were also found as if melted by fire. Researchers link this to abrupt natural events. The cause may have been powerful lightning floods or rapid temperature changes. In this way, a trace of the elements remained in the rock, and a new story was born in folk memory excited. And that is exactly why the glint is so important today. It is not just a beautiful landscape. It is a vast archive. It preserves traces of climate, trade, wars, beliefs, and everyday life. Even modern cities often repeat the old logic of the terrain. Street lines and neighborhood boundaries run along the escarpment, as if the land itself were suggesting the plan. The history of St. Petersburg and the entire northwest of Russia cannot be reduced to chronicles and late maps. Its deep layer lies here, in the sand and clay, in the remains of dwellings, in the burial mounds, in stone tools and glass beads. The more carefully we read these traces, the clearer a simple thought becomes. The glint was not the backdrop of history, but an active participant in it. It was here that nature and man together created that complex picture of the past which we are only beginning to understand. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you again soon.